Morning, everyone. Just give people a minute to join. Imagine it'll take people a couple of minutes to trickle in. So go ahead and get settled with your beverage of choice, etc. Morning. Hey, Becky. For the purposes of this Q&A, I'm going to be using the Q&A meeting tool, which you should be able to find by clicking in the lower right-hand side of your screen. There's a little grid of 9 dots, and it's in there under meeting tools. Not only does the Q&A let you post questions, either anonymously or not, it also lets you upvote other people's questions. And I'll be trying to tackle things as they are kind of the most useful things. For those joining on your phone, I have no idea where this setting is, but hopefully it's under meeting tools or something equally similar. So feel free to go ahead and pop some questions in there. It's fine if it's not like a concrete question, if it's just a thing that you'd like me to talk about for a little bit, as I just kind of keep letting folks in. So as a bit of background for those who don't know me, I'm Whitney Kippes. I'm one of the founding partners at BidBoss Consulting, but I have been freelance consulting since 2015, grew business kind of unintentionally back into a day job, and have now stepped back away from that to try and re-enter freelance consulting. I'm also providing a lot more services for consultants, trying to kind of plumb the knowledge that I have and share that with as many people as possible. Especially right now when a lot of different industries are kind of in flux, I think it's really useful to kind of think about consulting. I'm not going to be a consulting salesperson, so I'm not going to try and talk anybody into this. It's worked for me for the last 10 years, but I know it's not the life for everyone. So no pressure at all. Okay, can I get a thumbs up from folks who have found the question area? For those who have just joined, it is the 9 dots in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. You'll go to meeting tools and then you'll go to Q&A, where you can enter questions and upvote other people's questions. You should see a not question from me there about that being the spot to enter your questions. And we're a kind of small enough group too that I'd like to do a little bit more introductions. If you want to drop in the chat really quick, your name, location, and kind of where you're at thinking about consulting. If this is something that you're new to, if you're kind of well on your way. I know some of the people in here are kind of well established already. So, and then yes, go ahead and drop your questions in there. Cool. And since I'm seeing one question in there already, I'm going to go ahead and start with Lisa's question about how you recommend approaching a potential client. So Lisa, I'm going to put you on the spot for a second in case you want to elaborate on that question at all. Just share anything else that you've been thinking about where that question comes from.
Hi, Whitney. It's great to see you and see everyone on this call again. I think this is something that I've been thinking about for a long time. For those of you who don't know me, I consulted for about 3 years, and then I moved into the full-time workforce very briefly, and now I'm going back into consulting after the USAID situation. One thing that I've been thinking about is how to work with clients that I'm really excited about their mission. So I'm really passionate about gender equality work and work to combat gender-based violence, and I've seen some really amazing nonprofits that do work on those issues, and I would love to work with them, and I'm just having a hard time getting that initial contact sent. So I've tried to like email, add people on LinkedIn, and I know those methods aren't always 100% effective. So I'm just wondering if you have any advice on how to contact people.
That's a really good question. I've actually been having a sort of similar conversation with a few people lately, especially for folks that are wanting to kind of reach into slightly different industries than they've been in, or want to kind of go a little bit adjacent to what they've been doing in the past. And I think that you're kind of doing a couple of the things that I would recommend, which is essentially look for any possible warm introduction, any kind of opening. The other piece is more about what you say rather than how you say it, which is really framing things around what problems they're having or what issues they're having. So rather than approaching and saying, like, these are the services that I provide, like, do you need any of those things? Approaching more in like a almost informational interview type conversation of like, I'm really interested in what y'all are doing. I'd like to learn more about your work and the kinds of things that you do, and understand what challenges you're facing. And that framing can really help kind of smooth things over a little bit. I think it can be a lot more comfortable if you're like feeling a little bit of hesitancy on the like not wanting to sell yourself too much too. But I'm curious if anybody else has any thoughts on these things too. Feel free to drop your thoughts in the chat because I feel like that would be particularly useful. The other thing I would say, Lisa, is don't be hesitant to ask for introductions to people directly. I think this is something I always offer to people. Is I have a pretty widespread LinkedIn presence like right now. I think a lot of people do. And most people are pretty happy to make introductions. So if you're able to search on LinkedIn for people that are second tier connections, those are people that you have a direct connection with somebody that has a direct connection with them. That can be a really good way to find somebody who's like a warm lead. I have another idea too. Attend events that they're putting on or comment on their social media posts, other things that can kind of get you a bit of an introduction as well. Awesome. And as a reminder for those folks who are just getting joined, folks are doing some introductions in the chat, and then in the lower right-hand corner, you will find the 9 little dots for the meeting tools, where you'll find the Q&A, and you can both enter questions in there and upvote other people's questions. So feel free to drop some notes in there. Awesome. Oh, I see Linda. Here you entered that. I'll mark that one off. Cool. I'm not seeing any other questions in there quite yet. So y'all need to think about what you want to know about. I can talk about a couple of things that I think are particularly useful. There are kind of a couple of questions that people get, like ask me on a regular basis, especially if they're new to consulting and they're not really sure where to start. And most of those are about how do you kind of really approach people? How do you start making sure that people are aware that you're consulting? And this is also my favorite thing to ask people when they come to me asking questions about how they build a pipeline or how they build additional clients and expand their client base. And my answer is always the same, which is you need to tell people that you're consulting and you need to tell people how they can hire you. It can be really scary, especially at first, to, commit fully to the consulting life and say, this is what I'm doing, and tell people that it's happening. But people aren't going to know that they can hire you until you start telling them that's something that they can do. And I think that switch flipping is a really important part of the process. Becky, your question was, I want to do consulting, but I struggle to know where consulting ends and the task doing begins. Where is the boundary? Can you say more?
Sure. And I'm currently in a very loud coffee shop right now, and they turn the Frappuccino machine on, or like the blender, every time I talk. So I've had meetings all day, and this is a trend. Anyway, so what I want to do is like give people my ideas, and I love doing that. I am an ideas person. I'm a problem solver. I love doing it. But then when I do that, they're always like, "Well, can you implement it?" And I end up doing it because I'm like, I don't really want to turn down work, and I'm like, well, it'll be faster if I just do it, or like whatever, you know. But I want to do less of the tasks and just more of the big picture consulting. And I don't know, like I don't know where the consulting ends and the like becoming a contractor begins.
That's a good distinction to make. And I kind of differentiate that with like, I think it's good for all people who work as freelancers to have different service areas defined with different categories of the work that you do. And that is the work that falls in my strategic advising bucket. And often what I will do with that is a couple of things. One, I'll very clearly label it as advisory services. I often talk to people about how I will help them assess their current situation, identify areas for improvement. And then the additional piece there, if you want to get out of the doing, is that you need to have other people that you will refer the doing work to. And this is part of the benefit of having like a wide network of other consultants that you know, other people that you work with, so that you can refer on projects that you don't want to take on. Because I think that that's an important piece. There's another piece there too, which is building up the confidence to say no to things, which especially in a challenging context and like a landscape that feels very scarce and like there aren't a lot of opportunities, it can be really hard to say no to those things. But I continue to tell people that you have to think not only about the time that you're taking to do that work, but also the opportunity cost of what other work you could be doing instead. And that other work could be starting to advertise the fact that you do that kind of strategic work with clients, defining like packages for that kind of work and what it looks like, and giving people some specific materials even that tell them how you can help and what that benefit is. Those types of things are sometimes like a little harder to do, especially in this context where, yeah, it's easy to want to say yes to everything, but even when there feels like there isn't a lot of work, you still, like, everybody, obviously make your choices for yourself, but I think that it's important to not always say yes to everything that comes across your desk. Otherwise, you'll end up in the position that I always warned, because I do a lot of new business development consulting with folks, for those that aren't familiar with me. You end up in the situation where you're constantly putting out other people's fires rather than being proactive and strategic about what you want to do and investing in getting toward those things. It's a really different framing mostly, but helps you kind of move in that direction.
Thank you.
Thanks, Becky. Ooh, any advice for generalists trying to grow their consulting practice? Do you want to say more about that? I consider myself a bit of a generalist as well, so I have some thoughts.
Sure. So, I mean, I guess people always say like, oh, find your niche and market your niche, and like, you know, but like my niche is a decided lack of niche. Like I'm the person who leadership just kind of throws whatever doesn't fit neatly into a bucket at, and like they just kind of trust that I'll get it done and I'll figure it out. And the person that like plays well with the experts and can actually get them to do the things that they're recommending like actually get it done. But I find that can be when I look at a lot of like the requests for consultants out there, they're like, you need to be like an agronomist with a gajillion years of experience. And it's like, I can do the things that are being described, but you're like you're like looking for an expert when what you need is a generalist. And I don't know how to convince you that what you need is a generalist.
Got it. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I think there are two pieces going on there. And I'm going to write a note to myself so that I don't forget the second piece while I'm talking about the first piece. Convincing clients that they need something that they didn't realize that they need is an art form. And a lot of it relies a bit on how you present the information about yourself. Just like I spend a lot of time writing proposals. So just like in a proposal, I would try to echo what problems they're having and reinforce that could be solved in a different way. One of the things that I always said when I was talking about my skills as a non-technical expert who really knows how to write was simply saying that, like, you already have technical experts. This is what your organization is good at. You've got all the technical people that you need. What you need is somebody that can talk to those technical people, pull out all the information that they need, and write it down in a way that's going to be compelling and clear. And that soundbite took me about 2.5 years to develop and refine. So I don't want to say that this is like super, super easy. But the other thing that I was going to say is that part of this comes back to a bit of how you talk about and describe what you do. And my business partner, SJ, and I have a long history of saying that we tend to highly value the things that other people are very good at and highly undervalue the things that we are good at, because we think that they come naturally to everyone because they come naturally to us. And this is like a common human behavior that just persists, where the things that you were saying, talking about how you can kind of dive into any project, you can just take something and run with it. You will make sure the implementation happens after somebody's had like an idea to get something done, and you can wrangle a lot of people. All of those things are skills unto themselves. And those could be the niche that you're describing. So while you could say that you are sector agnostic or you're not a technical subject matter expert, you are an expert in something. And starting to describe it in that language can be really helpful. And it takes the framing off of the specific skill set that you're kind of emphasizing is more important. Now, I also want to say that if somebody is looking to hire an agronomist, they might actually be looking to hire an agronomist, and they might have reasons for doing that. So there are certain things where, like, it may simply not be the right opportunity for you. This is where I always think having a conversation with somebody is the best thing that you could possibly do. That gives you an opportunity to ask them more questions about what problems they're trying to solve, and then connect the dots between those problems and the things that you're good at. That makes sense.
Cool, thank you.
Awesome. Amy, I'm looking at your question. Starting to look for technical consulting positions on teams for large organizations like the World Bank, UN agencies, but don't have a plan for connecting with smaller organizations that might be interested in your services. Ideas for networking with organizations that you don't know exist. Ooh, that's a really good question. You want to say anything more about that before I dive into it?
No, I feel like it was a long question. It cut me off. I had to delete a few things, but I feel like it's like everyone knows about these big organizations. They do have some positions that are open that I presume many people are applying to, but then it's like I do like monitoring, evaluation, learning type of services. So I'm sure there are lots of small organizations that might want this, but I don't know them. They don't know me. Are there ideas for how to, apart from just like searching on LinkedIn or like things like that, how to find these organizations?
Well, a good amount of it is going to be searching, whether it's on LinkedIn or otherwise. But I think one of the things that it sounds like you're starting to do, which is useful, is define the types of services that you offer and who you might want to do that work for. Because the challenge is when you're searching is casting a pretty wide net. And it may be helpful to start with a more narrow niche to begin with, and then start to see where you get traction. So that might be looking specifically at smaller organizations that are based in the state where you live, or smaller organizations that serve communities near you. It could also be organizations that work in a specific technical area, or institutions of a particular type if you want to work specifically with nonprofit organizations or with law firms or whatever that might be, to narrow that down a little bit. How would that feel as like an initial starting point to narrow down the field of endless possibilities that is out there?
Yeah, I have a doctorate in education, so I have like education generally, like foundational learning is something people fund, and then my particular interest of like career to work transitions. So I'm very like I have a little niche I am trying to play in. It's just it feels like, okay, I like know the big players, and surprisingly they're not. I based in Greece. Surprisingly, they're not hiring and they're not local. So like, who are the small ones that that might be available? But the niche makes perfect sense. Sorry.
Yeah. It could also be worthwhile to look at membership organizations that serve the kind of client that you're looking at. So once you found one, it may be worth looking at like, what are they members of? So for example, that could be a lot of organizations are members of some sort of professional association. In the US, there's Humanitarian has a long list of organizations that are members, and that might be a good way to start narrowing down that pool even further. The other thing I like to ask organizations when you're talking to them are who they consider their peer organizations, because once you talk to one organization, then you get the list of like 5 other people that they think that there are their peers, even if they're not necessarily. But that gives you additional information as well, as a potential way to connect that. They're not going to necessarily have the same open calls for proposals that larger institutions do. And part of that is that they're going to have really flexy, likely, procurement policies, which means that if you can get a conversation with someone and you can sell them on what you do and what you like to do, there's more potential that they might be able to find something that works, where you might have the opportunity to define the scope together. That like collaborative scope definition is like my favorite kind of consulting project, because then you're working together to figure out what they need, not just responding to a solicitation specifically. Especially right now, those calls are getting flooded. So, and to the question, inspired by your question, advice for navigating the UN and World Bank systems. I agree that the system is quite opaque. I have yet to take a consulting assignment with either the World Bank or any of the UN agencies, in part because I think it's such a black box. I think their procurement policies are designed to appear very fair. And in reality, there's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes, where relationships are influencing things, and there's a procurement because they wanted to hire somebody and now they have to do a procurement in order to hire that person. So I feel like unless you've got like a connection at a particular agency, a connection with a particular group, that can be a bit of a black box. I do know a few people who have worked in that area, and if anybody on this call has any thoughts about navigating those systems, I'd be really interested in hearing that. But it can be definitely a bit of a black box to drop sort of. It's always sad when you like spend a lot of time crafting a beautiful response to a solicitation and then just hear silence, endless silence.
It sounds like it's
yeah,
similar to rosters in general, where you got on a roster, but now go make friends at that org who will pull you off the roster.
exactly. Yeah, because being on a roster doesn't necessarily mean that there is somebody that's hunting for work for you. I like to think of it as the equivalent, for those who do work in development, of like large awards that are funded at the HQ level, but then you have to get like a mission buy-in. You got to cultivate those relationships. And similarly, if you're on the roster for somebody, you got to reach out to like all the people that you think you could work with at that organization and make sure that they know that you're on a roster, which can be helpful. One thing that I've done in the past is once I was selected to be on somebody's roster or got a master service agreement with a particular client, I offered to host like an hour-long Q&A with their staff about what I do and how I could help some of them. And that was a really good way to kind of meet a lot of people at the same time. And since I wasn't charging them anything for that time, it was like, there's no reason why not from their side of things. So if anybody else has other thoughts about that, I'd be happy to think about that, talk more. Denise, looking at your question, do you ever find yourself worried about coming to the wrong answer, and how do you manage that? I'm used to working with teams to build solutions and bounce ideas off of, getting nervous about freelancing and being expected to have all the answers. Okay, I'm not sales pitching. However, this is exactly why BidBoss happened as an institution, and why I set up the new program that I'm offering, which is a consultant network, because I did not like that feeling of having to submit a deliverable that nobody else had thought of, and I hadn't been able to ask anybody any questions, and it was all very scary. So I think that it's very important to develop a community of colleagues, because just because we're freelancers does not mean that we have to work solo all the time. And having somebody else to even just answer a question or say, I think I've got the right conclusion, like, just can I have like 15 minutes, a half hour of your time just to like talk through what I'm doing, and then you can tell me if this makes sense, can be a really good way to do that. And all of that comes through finding colleagues and friends. It also means that if you are writing a rather large proposal and you suddenly become really not confident in your ability to edit your own writing, that you can take a couple of hours from your project and send them over to Lisa so she can copy edit things for you.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. I was wondering if I was the only one that had that sort of worry or fear, so I'm almost glad to know that I'm not the only one.
Oh yes, you are far from alone on that. I think that's actually one of the hardest things. I say that people who are really used to working in that team environment and people who define themselves as extroverts are the ones that are usually the most scared about freelance consulting, because of those limitations in working with other people. The other thing I would say is you can cultivate that kind of relationship with your clients as well, where you have somebody within the organization that is your trusted counterpart that you can ask those kinds of questions to, especially if you work with clients again and again, or if you have kind of like a friend on the inside. That can be a really useful way in kind of getting that feedback, and make sure you're capturing that as well.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Denise. Looking at Lisa's question, any advice on managing challenging situations with existing clients without losing their business? For example, delayed payments, scope creep, always urgent deadlines, etc. Ooh, is an art form. Is a definite art form. And something that takes time, practice, and confidence to do and develop, and will still feel kind of risky and rough. However, if you want to have any kind of boundaries in your consulting work, you have to decide that you're going to respect your own boundaries from day one, I think. That can evolve over time, but if you start off with I'm going to try and make everybody happy and it doesn't matter, I'm just going to be there to help, you will likely end up, if not completely underwater, then unhappy, I would say. So I think that it's important to practice those things on small changes, especially if you find yourself wanting to say yes to something that is outside the scope of your current assignment. A very nice way to say that is to say, yes, I can do that. It's not included in my current scope though, so it's going to be some additional LOE. And get used to practicing statements like that. That can take a lot of practice. And it takes a while to feel comfortable knowing that that will get an okay response. I think it's really easy to start out thinking that, especially when these things happen, that it's due to some sort of, not that it's due to malintent, but it's like it's going to end in a conflict of some kind. And I think most of our stress comes from anticipating the conflict, not from actually going through the situation. For example, if somebody has a delayed payment, the most stressful thing is telling them that they have a delayed payment because you don't know how they're going to respond to that. Now, if you enter that interaction assuming that your client is a human being just like everyone else, and this probably fell through the cracks somewhere and you like them, then I think it can be easier to say, hey, like this invoice was supposed to be paid by X date, wondering what's happening. Is this working its way through your procurement process? Trying to depersonalize it, I think, can help a lot, where it's not about the individual. Usually that individual is somebody who is, if you present them as an ally to you and they're in the situation that you're trying to navigate, then they will act as an ally to you in the situation that you're trying to navigate. There are certain things that I take a very hard line on. And most of those things have to do with my personal pet peeves. So creating your own organizational policies is another way to navigate this. For example, I, as a solo consultant, had a policy on late payment fees and what the fees were if somebody was going to pay me late. That continued at BidBoss. That will continue as long as I am consulting, that if you're going to pay me late, I'm going to charge you something for it, because that gave me an unnecessary amount of stress. And I think that that consultants need to like advocate for themselves in that kind of situation, which can be very hard to do. Does that help, Lisa? I'm curious if there's anything else that you want to talk through on that front.
Yeah, it definitely helps. I've had challenges in particular with one client, and it's always very small dollar amounts. Like right now, I have an invoice for $300 for work that I completed in February, and they used to pay me after 30 days, and then they moved it to 60 days, and now it's 90 days. And I really enjoy doing the work, and it's not like a huge amount of money, but I just don't want that to keep happening. And I have the suspicion that if I didn't follow up, they would never pay me. And I don't want to have to keep being in that situation. So yeah, I think I like what you said about treating the person as an ally. And I tend to be kind of nervous about reaching out to someone and saying, I just typically ask, hey, can you provide an update on the payment status of this invoice? But I've never charged a late fee for it, and it's something that I've thought about. But I'm also afraid that charging some kind of interest or late fee would make me lose that client. So yeah, something to still keep thinking about.
Yeah. I mean, it's important to think that like if they're continuing to come back to you, they like working with you. And if you like working with them, then you should be able to work together to find something that works for both of you. And just to answer Rebecca's question in the chat, you put policies on late payments into contracts when you take on work. Yes. I have a one sentence that I tell clients that they need to add to my contracts because I've been burned too many times. I had a client that, a large institutional client who could afford to pay a late fee several years ago, come back to me and say that despite the fact that our contract had net 30 payment terms in it, the fact that it didn't have any consequences specified for what happened after if they didn't pay within net 30 terms, they weren't going to pay our late fee. So since then, it's in every single contract, every single time. And I think it's really easy to want to rush through contracts. This might be my personal perspective. I don't like reading contracts. It's not fun. Also, I tend to not be super detail oriented, especially when it matters. But there are a handful of things that I double check and triple check are in there. And they are mostly related to these things that will, if they are clearly stipulated in the contract, will save me a headache later on. Usually the way that I do that is simply when I receive a draft of the contract or a draft of a purchase order, and it has specific payment terms in it, I will respond to whoever sent it to me and say, can you please add the sentence in where it says payment terms, that specific section. This is our standard policy across all client agreements. And usually that works. Sometimes I have to say that several times to several different people before they're okay with it. But as long as you stay consistent in the message, I think you'll usually get results. Usually people want to hire you and they want to make it happen. And they're pretty confident that they're going to pay you within the stipulated time anyway, because that's how their procurement process works and their accounts payable are often doing their thing. But I do think it's important. I'm just noticing, Rebecca, that you had another question there too. There's a Q&A tool lower right-hand side in the area that says meeting tools, where you can drop that in. The other piece that you said about always urgent deadlines, Lisa, is another thing that I tend to look at. And I think you've probably run into this working with BidBoss too, is when I send people estimates for work, they always include a nice little statement at the bottom of them that say, if you want me to start work within 5 days, there's going to be an extra 10% urgency fee tacked on this. And that's because I have to rearrange my entire schedule to make this work because you decided to send me this at the last minute. And again, for clients that you like working with, for clients who like hiring you, they should be able to understand that. It may take a little bit of pushback, but I do like to think that we can do a lot in terms of client education on how best they can work with us, and make that. Sometimes they just don't know what a headache they're causing us by doing what they're doing, and explaining those things can help. There was one other note that I had written down to myself, which was about if you didn't follow up on the invoices that you sent them, you might never get paid. Automate that so you don't have to do it. whether you're using whatever invoicing software you're using, or if you're just scheduling emails in Gmail to go out 30 days after you send an invoice to somebody, make it automated so that you don't have to think about it. And that way it's also a form email that goes out. That way you don't have to worry about it too much. Now I get very guilty sounding clients responding to automated emails where I get to tell them, oh, don't worry, I've already got your payment. That was an automated email that went out. I just didn't categorize the payment correctly. So then suddenly they are apologizing to me about accidentally maybe paying us late rather than the other way around. It's an art form though. And again, all of this takes practice. So I'm going to tackle that question first from Rebecca. I was collaborating with someone from an organization on an assessment, and he took months to review our deliverable. Is there any way I can subtly message to the client that he was the bottleneck in the process? I'm concerned that this process has made it look like I'm not working efficiently. Ooh, this is a really good question. There are a couple things that I would suggest. If and when I have deliverables to send to a client as part of a scope of work, which is almost all the time, I like to include either in a kickoff conversation that I have about the project with the client, in the contract itself, or in the scope of work somewhere, what the acceptance criteria are for deliverables and how long they have to give me feedback. And part of this I learned from people who are like graphic designers as consultants. They're very clear on like, you have to give me X by this date, otherwise I'm not going to be able to do anything. And I think having that clearly spelled out, even if it's just a conversation that you have at the start of a project where you agree to something and then send it in an email to them to say, this is what we agreed to, you can communicate that relatively clearly. I always think it's easier to do that upfront than it is to do after a problem has already emerged. So that's like a slightly different handling situation. If it's something that has happened already and something that is then a struggle for you to navigate and to continue doing your work, first, I would not be very hesitant to send reminder emails or ask for feedback. It can often feel like nagging if you are the person that's saying like, oh, did you receive this? Did you have any comments on it? Did you want, I need your feedback to move to the next stage. But again, seeing our clients as our allies and things, it's very possible that this just dropped off the priority list for them and something else came up. So getting them to provide a clear timeline on when they'll get back to you is important. The other thing that I like to do as a common practice is a debrief with a client after a project where I collect feedback from them and I share a little feedback for them on what I thought worked well, what I thought didn't work well. This comes from a long history of working on proposals with people. And again, depersonalizing it as much as possible and saying like, maybe the timeline for this project wasn't the best if it hit at a time when you couldn't provide feedback in a very quick way. The other thing that I do, and I'm curious about if other folks are doing this as well, is I have standard scopes of work that I send clients. So those scopes of work describe the variety of service areas that I cover, and they provide very standard language about a lot of different types of work that I do. And they provide clear information about what the client needs to do as well. So for example, in my I'm a proposal writer scope of work, it says in there that a proposal writer does not substitute for an organizational decision maker or input provider, and that I cannot write a proposal without input from the client and decision making from the client. There's a nice little paragraph in there that says, like, if you don't give me what I need, then I cannot meet your deadlines. And usually, if a client asks me about it, I say, I put it in there because I've had some past experiences where folks didn't get me stuff when I needed it. And I just want to make sure that clients understand that like I can't just like go over in a corner and write a proposal for you. That's not how this works. And most of them are like, yep, I get it. Understood. These are all the resources that we have for you. So I think always putting the blame on a past hypothetical client works well too. That's often what I blame our late fee policy on too, is I say, there was one client, you know, and they were really difficult about this, and now I just don't take chances anymore. And now I ask for it to be in every contract. Cool. Rebecca, seeing your other question, would you be able to share a bit about how you created your brand, both as an independent consultant and then for BidBoss? This is a thing that I do a little bit without thinking, which I have come to realize is not something that everybody does without thinking. So I'm starting to try and do that process where I value my own expertise. Part of this comes from my background in proposal writing and in like the kind of marketing and sales that is. And a lot of it comes from wanting people to hire me for who I am, not because I could do random stuff for them. A lot of that grew out of a lot of frustration where I was taking on assignments that I didn't really like. And so I wanted to more clearly communicate to clients who I was, what I liked doing, how I talked about the work that I do, how I talk about the clients that I have, so that they could understand who that is. Now, I have on our website a nice little like consultant branding workbook that might be helpful. But it essentially walks through that, like, who are the clients that you want to work with? How would you describe your services? What do you want to be doing more of? What do you want to be doing less of? To navigate through those questions about how you really define yourself. From there, turning that into a brand is really about just consistent communication. That's all branding is consistent use of the same information. People often associate that with like graphic identity specifically. So that can be a specific color palette you use, a specific set of fonts, a website if you feel like you need a website, not everybody does. It can also include like having a logo, what you call your business, all of those things. When I was freelance consulting, I found one particular picture that I wanted to use as my professional headshot. I pulled a couple of colors out of that picture to use as my color scheme. I believe it was a red and a blue, and maybe there was probably a neutral in there, so probably a white. And that became my like color scheme. And I updated my little invoice template so that it used the same colors. I created like a little logo. I'm not even remembering what my logo looked like for my independent consulting business, but I'm sure I have it somewhere in my files. I think it was probably my initials in a circle. That feels like something that I maybe played with for a while. And then it's just about using that consistently. Now, what I think is actually more important than your cute little graphics and your color scheme and everything is the words that you use. So having some standard terminology that you use to talk about your services, to talk about yourself, to talk about how you work is almost more useful. That stuff I kept in a Google Doc. And it came in the form of standard answers to client questions, standard little service descriptions, and a little, I always hated the idea of having like a like elevator pitch, so to speak, but I always had the elevator bullet points. And having that language gave me a lot of information about how to really tell people who I was in a consistent way. For Bid Boss, that is essentially an evolution of what we did. Bid Boss had a much more complicated like marketing strategy that emerged over time, but it was very similar in terms of telling a consistent story, making sure we were speaking to clients' problems primarily, and talking about how the work that we did could solve those problems. And all of that connected back together. I could talk about branding for a really long time, which is actually why I'm hosting a webinar in, I want to say, a month, 6 weeks maybe, which is going to be a 2-hour workshop on marketing your consulting business. And we're going to talk about branding in there. Practically speaking, you want to investigate the website Canva, which I will put in the chat really quick. Canva is your solution to how do I do that? I'm not a graphic designer. How do I do that? Canva is the how that I do that. And it is for a lot of people, especially given the fact that a lot of the stuff that they do is free. And the fancy paid membership that we had to use for BidBoss so that we could have like a bunch of different team members and stuff was only like $120 for the year. So very affordable way to do like all of your marketing in one place. Linda, your question is related to branding, noting that some people have a moving personal story in their About Me section. They survived a natural disaster, overcame a serious medical condition. Some people don't have any personal information at all. What are my thoughts on striking the right balance? Ooh, this is highly personal. For me, I have found that making myself a little bit uncomfortable with vulnerability and sharing more about who I am helps me connect with people. So telling people that a big part of why I got into consulting to begin with was actually getting fired from a job. That was not a great adventure, but it's actually, I kind of fell into consulting unexpectedly. Then I fell into running a consulting company unexpectedly, and had a lot of fun doing that. But sharing that experience helps people understand more about who you are. So I do think that there is value in it. I don't think that there is value in saying something just because you can say it. So I'm not sure that there's a lot of value in saying something that isn't built around the idea that it's going to help you build connections with people. Like, I'm not going to tell every personal story that I have on the internet for marketing purposes. But if I tell people that how I ended up getting fired was because I was super burned out and I jumped into a new job when I shouldn't have because I was burned out. And part of what I want to do is help people navigate burnout and find sustainable careers. That helps and it's useful. But I don't think anyone should share anything that's not something that they feel comfortable sharing, that they feel contributes to how they want to be seen in the world. I think sharing those stories is connecting authentically. And I think that that's always been an important part of how I do work. Is I want to build authentic relationships with people. And in order to do that, I need to be an authentic version of myself. Yeah. Awesome. We have about a little over 5 minutes left in the session, and Rebecca tossed in the question that I love to answer. Which are thoughts on consulting as an individual sole proprietor versus an LLC? This is a US-centric question primarily, although I believe it applies in other countries as well. Terminology is probably different. A tax professional will tell you that there's not a huge difference between being a sole proprietor and having an LLC. A lawyer will tell you that an LLC will prevent you from losing a lot of your personal assets if your business were to be sued for some reason. As consultants, our potential liability is pretty limited to begin with, given that setting up an LLC takes very little time and usually costs not very much money. I usually recommend that people do it. It's generally not that complicated, and it doesn't really change how you do work. Setting up an LLC can lead you to do further complicated tax things, however, which can potentially save you money in taxes. But I am not the expert to talk about that. And I can plug another webinar that we're having in July, where Mike, who has been the Bid Boss accountant for a handful of years now and supports, I think, a number of people, consultants that I've worked with, will answer some questions about the kind of accounting tax side of being a freelancer. Since he's worked with a number of international development folks too, he's also helpful in the what do I do when somebody wants to collect foreign tax on stuff? How does that work? Question, which I always appreciate. Yeah, I know, Rebecca. I just happen to have webinars really well placed for all of the other things. Sabrina's attending another webinar on the risky truth about single member LLCs. Even if you have an LLC, you might not be protected from liability. Potentially true. Ooh, lawyers have more opinions on this, potentially. I do think it's good for people to have liability insurance. It's usually pretty cheap if you tell people that all you do is provide a service. That's you talking to people, telling them stuff. Usually you can't have much of a liability for that. Most of that will be related to liability insurance. Gets expensive when you have a physical location, primarily because people can injure themselves inside of your physical location. But there aren't too many issues with that. This has been really fun. I might do this on a regular basis. I feel like I could talk about consulting realities forever, and that's probably what I'm going to spend the next few years doing. In addition to the consultant network that I just set up, I'm also launching a course for new consultants. It's going to be all of this, but in much more detail and much more structured. Mapped out 6 weeks of content to take people essentially from no idea to up and running, talking about building a pipeline, talking about building a marketing strategy, all of that. So you'll find more information about that on the BidBoss website, which is bidboss.org, because .com was taken and I still can't find it. Someday that will be the problem that I solve. We didn't talk about websites at all. I don't think people need them necessarily, but I do think that having some marketing tool and some way for people to find you is useful, especially some way for people to schedule meetings with you, because that's one of the best ways to connect with people one-on-one, is to make sure that they know what you do and how to find you, how to talk to you, how to hire you. That's like the recipe. People don't know that you're consulting, they will never work with you. Awesome. Thank you all for being here, taking the time. This session has been recorded, so I'm going to send that link out to everybody who registered, just in case they weren't able to be here. And if there are any other topics, feel free to drop me an email at any time. My name is Whitney at bidboss.org, so you can find me there. If not, happy to chat about this stuff all the time. It's my favorite thing to do.
Thank you so much, Whitney. This was great.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate you taking the time. I'll have to do this again, maybe. Thanks, all.
Thank you.